This is a paper that we did a couple of years ago already for the WDR, the World Development Report for the World Bank, as a background paper. And now we're trying to update this paper with more up-to-date data and a bit of a different estimation structure, on which I would like to have your advice. And so I'm going to sort of present the frameworks and what it basically is, what we are going to measure. And then the two estimation procedures, one that was used in the paper a couple of years ago, and now for an update, because to my sort of what I can see, it's a bit of a slightly more up-to-date estimation, modern estimation procedure using gravity. And some of the people here are experts in gravity, so that's very welcome. So basically what it is it's very simple. We try to, or we have quantified the regulatory frameworks that different countries in the world apply regarding personal data. And what does it entail? It entails the personal data, how it can flow from one country to another, as well as how it is being regulated for its domestic use. So once you have that foreign personal data, how are companies able and allowed to process the data to provide services? And so these different regulatory models that we observe in the world is used in a gravity model to see how they have an effect on digital services trade. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but that is basically the bottom line. So what do I have here? First, a categorization of the different regulatory frameworks of how different countries regulate personal data. And what do we see? We see three different models in the world. And so then I explained something about the empirical strategy. Again, there are two, of which I would like to have your comments on the second one, the second empirical estimation strategy using gravity, and then some of the sort of, conclusions, policy conclusions, that's sort of further thinking about this. So first, the three data models. So the taxonomy really looks like this. I mean, there is one sort of regulatory model that is very open, where there is no specific regulations in place to transfer that data from one country to another. So the free flow of data, basically. And it's based on sort of a self-assessment schemes that firms can apply. There is ex-post accountability in some of these countries, but the bottom line is it's fairly free. That also counts for domestic data processing. So what you often see is that countries, some countries apply a privacy framework, but in this particular case of open transfers, an open sort of regulatory model, there is none. And so there is a lack of comprehensive data protection framework, basically, that regulates the data privacy or the privacy of the data subject, the citizens. The second one is the regulatory safeguards model that put conditions, regulatory conditions on how far these personal data can flow from one country to another. So a firm wants to let sort of personal data go from one country to another, but needs to fulfill all sorts of administrative conditions, forms, contract clauses that are fairly expensive, and then data can flow between countries. And what you often see is that these countries also implement a framework for data privacy. Now, then you have a third one that is called the control model, where there is really strict sort of restrictions or regulations that localize that personal data. Either it needs to go on a domestic data server, either it needs to, it needs to condition that the company that wants to deal with that data of the country that imposes that restriction needs to establish a data center, for example, or needs to hold a copy on a domestic data center, and then only is allowed to have that data flow from one country to another. So there are strict conditions of basically localization criteria involved, and it's very hard to let the personal data flow from one country to another. And I mean, on the domestic side, there are extensive exceptions. So, one law might say, yes, I mean, you are allowed to process that, but there are clear security exceptions. And so therefore, it's becoming also very expensive for the government to work with the personal data that comes from abroad. And so if you classify all these different or the three different data models, as we say, I mean, it becomes fairly sort of straightforward that you have a picture that looks like this, where if you look at the cross-border element of these data transfers, you have the open model that is very much sort of centered around the US. and other countries are following that, like Canada or Mexico. You have the other extreme of the closed model that is very much sort of, pushed forward by China, or not pushed forward, but China has it in large part and tried to convince other countries to also adhere to their sort of regulatory standards. And then you have this regulatory safeguard model in the middle that is very much driven by the EU, right? So the GDPR is the most sort of, the most straightforward, sort of the most or the regulatory model that comes up in many people's minds, because that is the regulatory model that the EU has to regulate personal data flows. And now it sort of also goes into other regulatory packages that regulate non-personal data, but the GDPR is the one to look at. And that has all these sort of standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules involved that makes it very expensive for the firm to allow for the cross-border data flows. Now here, this is a picture that shows it for the domestic data processing. You see some differences, right? So Canada and Mexico, but again, there is this sort of three-way pattern that you see here in the world. Now, this is a picture that shows you how it looks like, I mean, in terms of descriptive, how it looks like if two country pair or one country pair, like an importer and exporter, share that same regulatory model, because that eventually is something that we are measuring on digital services trade. And so how does it look like? Well, you do see that if you look at the left panel, you do see that countries that share the European model, I mean, to put it simply, I mean, you see that it covers on the data, on the basis of the database that we use, a quarter of all digital services trade flows that we have, but it covers a larger sort of population. And then a smaller fraction is from the open data model. And of course, the largest fraction is of sort of countries that do not share a similar data model. And that is, I think, explained to a great extent by the US and the EU, because the US and the EU is, so to speak, sort of the largest digital services trade bilateral relationship in the world. And I mean, they don't have the same data model. The same you can do for the domestic processing part of all these data models or regulatory data models. And I mean, the picture looks more or less the same, where China has a bit of a bigger population or size of the market, basically, compared to what it trades. It trades only a tiny fraction there. So, but I mean, these are descriptive statistics, just to show you what's going on. But to measure it, I mean, we sort of applied two gravity models. Again, the first one was applied a couple of years ago, and now I'm trying to update this with a new one. But first, the first one is really a standard gravity model where things vary, or the data varies between importer and exporter, so the origin destination. And the second one is by origin destination and sector, where we sort of include the digital sector element in the gravity model. So, but first, the first one. So again, a standard gravity model where you have an importer and exporter, and we use that in a panel. So whether the importer and exporter share the data model sort of varies over time, because we have sort of classified how that sort of changes over time. When a country chooses for one regulatory model and another country chooses another regulatory model, and whether they have, a similar set of or a similar data model in place is going to be measured in the gravity model, and whether that has an impact on digital services trade. So we do that with a simple dummy. And the way you need to look at that is that it's not really a PTA variable, but it's more like, if you remember that literature from Laporta and I think Schaifer, if I'm not mistaken, back in the days, about sort of the legal origins, right? So there were three different types of legal systems that they classified, the Anglo-Saxon, the Continental, I think the German, and another one. And so so it's sort of closely related to that. And instead of the legal systems, we apply, whether you have an open, a conditional, or a closed model of data transfers and domestic data processing. And so we break down these two components as well in the gravity data set. So just to go very quickly, because I don't have really much time. But I mean, this is the setup basically, and here you have it in form of an equation where we include standard trade cost variables, because we also try to apply sort of the bilateral fixed effects that would otherwise, control for all these standard gravity variables, and that was not possible. And so we relaxed those fixed effects a little bit. And so then, I mean, we apply sort of a more loose set of fixed effects. But then, of course, you need to add all these control variables that are related to gravity, and also some of the domestic regulatory sort of other things that are going on inside the country. And you can do this now with sort of domestic trade flows and take them out and, you know, multiply those with international trade flows. And so that's also what we did. And then you can get to some of the results that we did see in the previous paper of how these, you know, sharing one data model has in terms of a positive impact or positive correlations with digital services trade, or a negative one. And all the rest, I mean, you know, the standard gravity type of rules are applied. You know, we use it, the PPML, we do clustering. And so that is, I think, at least back in the day, okay. But in the meantime, of course, I mean, other types of trade data databases have come forward. And so we use that in a second empirical strategy. So some of the things are sort of a bit weak in this specification, but that's going to be dealt with in the second sort of empirical strategy. And so we use TIVA data that was back in the days available. That was the TIVA 2018 that went up to the year, I think, 2016 or 17 or something. Okay, so these are the results. Now, quickly, I mean, so we do perform these regressions by different categorization of digital services trade, right? And so that literature, or sort of that gravity rule, has also a bit evolved over the years, if I'm not mistaken, because now it's sort of, now people take total trade, right? Or total, in this case, digital services trade. So you sum up these sectors together. But, you know, back in the days, a couple of years ago, it was not the case. And so this was the main result. And what you do see here is, I mean, there's a lot of coefficient results, but the bottom line is that, I mean, there is a positive trade correlation between countries having the open model in place on digital services trade. That is something that you would expect, because if you look, for example, the US or other countries who have this open model in place, they do not have any requirement for data localization, nor something that they condition on, like having that data being localized or not, right? So there are no sort of costly measures in place. On the contrary, if you look at the regulatory safeguard model, I mean, in the head category, there's a positive sort of coefficient result, but sometimes also negative. And that somehow resonates with how we know that, for example, the GDPR is sort of working, because you need to adhere to these strict safeguards. But then again, I mean, yeah, so then if you do that, data can flow freely, but it comes at a cost price. And sort of the direction of trade in this case is not always sort of clear cut. Whereas for the Chinese model, or to put it more correctly, the government controlled model, there is a clear negative coefficient result. And so that somehow makes sense. Now, regarding the domestic regulatory component of these models, there you see a sort of an inverse patterns, where you do see that regulatory frameworks that have a lack of these data privacy rules, they show a negative and statistical significant coefficient result in some of these sectors. Whereas for the regulatory safeguards, I mean, you have a positive coefficient result. Somehow, I mean, some of these policymakers that have these regulatory safeguards like in place, they, I think, would see that as a confirmation that, you know, they are trying to put these rules or propose these rules, or have these rules in place because they want to generate trust in the digital economy. And their argument is always then saying, yeah, but, you know, once you have that trust in the digital economy, you have more trade. And so to the extent that we can sort of see these trade correlations, that sort of resonates with that argument, right? With this sort of positive statistical coefficient result. Whereas again, for the Chinese model, there is a negative one. So that also makes sense, because that's very close. And so now, I mean, of course, again, I mean, you know, we need to control for the standard gravity forces and a couple of other things like the DTRI or the DSTRI, the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, also the ability of countries the strength of their sort of digital infrastructure measured by the World Economic Forum NRI, what is it? The Network Readiness Index. I mean, all these things are included, and then you get these results now. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, further thoughts about like a potential update is, I mean, back in the days, we did use the TIFA data, but of course, the TIFA data has a component involved that is imputed or estimated. And so, you know, there is other data now available by the US ITC that is called the ITPDE database. And the nice thing of that database is that it only records or reports trade flows that are really reported by statistical agencies. So there's no sort of imputed trade data. The other thing is, I mean, you would like to maybe differentiate the effect by sort of whether a sector is classified as a digital service or not, right? And so how does one need to do that? And so one of the tricks that we apply here is to make a distinction between whether a services sector is classified as digital and non-digital, and interact that with, you know, that variable that measures whether the importer and exporter over time has the same data model in place. And so there is a bit of a difference in different component involved that I would like to have some feedback on. And then the third thing is, you know, when presenting some of these the different conferences is, I'm not finished yet because there is a second part, but I'll go very slow or very quickly. The switchers, right? Because what we also see over time is that some countries switched from a US model to a European model. So they had a framework in place that was fairly open, and then they went to a conditional one. Now, just very quickly on that second empirical strategy is, so the bottom line here is that we interact that variable that measures whether a country pair has that data model or shares that data model over time, multiplied by whether a services sector is digital or not, right? So, and you have a importer-exporter sector time dimension here. And that's in a way, I mean, nice, because then you can control for all the other stuff that is taking place, such as, for example, an FTA, right? Because an FTA varies by origin, destination, import-to-export time. But, you know, having the sectoral dimension involved, I mean, you can control for all this stuff. And then again, I mean, we split up between the three models, of course, and then break down by the two components of, you know, the cross-border flow aspect of these regulatory models and the data processing aspect. So again, then you have a sort of a formal model here. And again, what I said, you know, all these sort of standard gravity controls are absorbed in a fixed effect. Also, what, you know, is going on domestically, interact that with this international dummy is also applied and again, or absorbed. And then again, I mean, we use PPML cluster by importer, exporter year, and we use the ITPDE data set. Quickly, what then is, of course, the question, how do you measure digital services? Well, I mean, there's some sort of metrics developed over the years, how you sort of, you know, can measure that. But then the literature is not very clear cut. Also in the policy framework, there's not a clear definition of how we should see digital trade or digital services trade. And so therefore there is a narrow definition and there is a wider definition, and all the four definitions that you see here is being used, right? So the narrow definition only includes information services and computer, and the more broader definition includes business services and then a bit of finance. And then if you go to the broadest one, I mean, it also includes education, health, and finance. What is it, like tourism? Why? Because in some of these metrics, we do see that they're very either software intensive, and if not, I mean, they do deal with a lot of personal data. And so they would be reliant on, you know, the regulatory framework that deal with these kind of data policies. And so here are the results, and the results are more or less in line for what we see with the more looser type of gravity model, the first empirical estimation strategy for the cross-border element as well as for the domestic regulatory element. And what do we see? So it sort of echoes the main result, with one difference is the Chinese model. So the Chinese model here has, you know, positive trade correlations if you look at the cross-border element, right? So other countries that adhere would have implemented the regulatory system that China has, somehow they have a very weak but positive coefficient result, which is interesting because that, I think, poses a lot of question on many developing countries, well, not many, but some developing countries that are incentivized to adopt the China model. I mean, according to this result, it's somehow positive, but, you know, so should we be concerned about this if you are a policymaker? Now, the other difference is, like, so if you look at the domestic regulatory component, again, it sort of largely follows what we have seen before, except for the fact that the positive coefficient results of the EU model or the regulatory safeguards model, I mean, it comes out as positive, but in this case, insignificant. So those people that were sort of advocating for having these strict rules in place of how you process data because of the privacy of the data subject, i.e. citizens, you know, to generate that trust, I mean, here that falls away because the coefficient becomes sort of insignificant here. Okay, I don't know how much time I've left, but otherwise I can.
You can have another minute.
Okay. So then we also have the switchers, right? So, I mean, one way you could think of so far, I mean, what we have done is trying to see what patterns are sort of observable because, you know, with the strict fixed effects, you could say, okay, there's an impact, but if you are more careful, I mean, you say there are sort of trade correlations. And then one of the comments that we had was, well, maybe it's also very interesting to look at the switchers because there is some variation over time of countries that have implemented the US model or the open model, but then somehow, you know, over the years switched to an EU model, or they switched to an, to a China model. And here there's a small mistake because the CG, the government controlled model, is the Chinese model. So that's a mistake. And so again, I mean, you do that on the basis of the second empirical strategy where you use import to export to sector year dimension, right? And so that's something that we use. But then, I mean, we did not sort of use a four-way clustering, but still a three-way clustering. So that's also something you can think about. And then in some of these, well, in particular, the EU model, the regulatory safeguard model, there is, I mean, the role of an adequacy saying that, I mean, as soon as another country, a bilateral sort of relationship of another country has that framework in place that, you know, can adequately deal with how I want you to deal with personal data of my citizens, I give you an exception that, you know, this data can flow freely between my market and your market. But then again, many other sort of countries that follow the regulatory safeguard model of the EU also have adequacy. So how to deal with that? And that complicates things, but I mean, that's for later. But first the switchers, and that's what we sort of have done so far. And the other two bullet points we have not dealt with. So, and very quickly, I mean, this is a bit of an overview of who are those switchers. The list is longer than this, but there are quite a number of countries that have switched in our timeline. And so they go from an open, again, to the safeguard one or the controlled one for both the cross-border element and the domestic regulatory element. So there's quite some variation. And again, if you take or if you select only the switchers that go from an open model to the EU model, I mean, you don't really see any effect on the cross-border element in any case. That's what you see here on the left-hand side. But you do see a positive and significant coefficient result for the narrow definition of digital trade for those who opted for the EU model, right? And so again, this is somehow positive for the European policymaker because again, sort of, I guess that they will see that as substantiating that argument that you have that trust in the digital economy. Now, for the China model, that's a negative sort of result here, what we see. And so what does it mean is that, again, I mean, if you go from an open US kind of type of model to a Chinese model, I mean, you experience a loss in any case. I mean, that's what the negative and significant coefficient result shows you here. And so in conclusion, I mean, there is this variation between which model you apply using a gravity model. And yeah, this is basically, you know, the result of all these regression in grosso modo. Right, so it makes sense intuitively because the safeguard model is somehow associated with these costs of transferring personal data from one country to another. So to have this negative and significant sort of coefficient finding that you will see, you know, in the first column there, but then significant for domestic regulatory aspect, and then the control model is somehow, yeah, well, with the up-to-date positive for the cross-border, but negative for domestic regulatory aspect. And then the role of switchers, as I've explained, also somehow makes sense. So in that sense, I mean, I'm happy, but also very curious what you have to say about this. Thank you.